Morning, everyone. Welcome to Grand Rounds. Next week, we have a Grand Rounds that will be presented by Susan Kester, who's the Deputy Director of the Division of Neuroscience and Basic Behavioral Science of the NIMH. So everyone who is funded by the NIMH or wants to be, particularly if you're doing preclinical or translational research, will want to come and see her and kiss her ring. Blair will be hosting her, so if you want to get on a schedule for anything, talk to Blair. We have a bunch of announcements. I don't want to take up too much time, but I do want to mention them. Christina Brezing received a 5-year K-23 from the NIH for a randomized controlled trial of lacacerin to treat cannabis use disorder. Dev Devnand received a 5-year R01 from NIA, olfactory impairment in offspring of racial disparities in Alzheimer's. Adi Talati received a 3-year R01 from NIMH for a multi-cohort assessment of gestational SSRI exposure on long-term psychiatric outcome. Michael Compton, a 4-year R01 from NIMH for a trial of police mental health linkage system for jail diversion. So this is what he presented in Grand Rounds a few weeks ago. Steve Rayport got a 5-year R01 from NIMH for a project targeting co-transmission for circuit-specific pharmacotherapy. Guillermo Jorga received a 5-year R01 from NIH. Deficient belief updating as a convergent computational mechanism of psychosis. Marissa Spann, a 5-year R01 from NIMH on intergenerational transmission of deficits in self-regulatory control. Richard Sloan, a 5-year R01, NIA, dietary modulation of neuroinflammation and age-related memory disorders. Terry Goldberg, a 5-year R01 from NIA for novel cognitive and functional measures of Alzheimer's disease prevention trials. And Christiane Duarte received the mother of all grants, at least for this week, a 5-year, $15 million UH3 from NIH for breaking the cycle of intergenerational disadvantages, neurodevelopment among Puerto Rican children, otherwise known as the ECHO grant. So congratulations to them. And just to mention the conference that's coming up, the WPA, is Roberto Luis Fernandez here? The WPA is holding anybody know about this conference? In 2 or 3 or 4 weeks? Anyway, it's the World Psychiatric Association is meeting on the Morningside campus. I forget the exact date, but it's 4 weeks from now. And then also Al Landa and Brian Fallon are sponsoring their 4th Columbia Psychosomatics Conference here at NISBE on October 21st and 20th and 21st. So today we have a speaker who I think exemplifies, all of the hidden treasures, intellectually speaking, that is, that exist within the university, and that's Dr. Kimberly Noble. Dr. Noble is currently an associate professor of neuroscience and education at Teachers College, but she began getting her bachelor's degree at the University of Pennsylvania, then received her PhD in neuroscience with a thesis topic on socioeconomic status, modulating cognition achievement and brain behavior relationships at Penn, and then an MD at Penn. She then came to Columbia and NYP for her postgraduate training in pediatrics, and in the interim completed a postdoctoral fellowship in cognitive neuroscience with Bruce McCandless and B.J. Casey at Cornell. Dr. Noble has really, I think, integrated disciplines that are novel and incredibly consequential because they sort of verge on environment, sociology, and pathology, particularly as affects brain development. And as a result of that, she's been highly productive in terms of her scholarly work and funding. And I think better than me talking about it, I can give you an example by just mentioning some of the publications, and you'll get a flavor for what she does. So there was a publication in Developmental Science on the neural correlates of socioeconomic status in the developing human brain. Publication in Nature Neuroscience, neurocognition and genetics pertaining to family income, parental education, and brain development in children and adolescents. Another publication, Brain and Cognition, Cortical Thickness and Neurocognitive Skills During Childhood, in relation to socioeconomic factors. And publication, Developmental Neuroscience, The Independent Interacting Effects of Socioeconomic Status and Dual Language Use in Brain Structure and Cognition. So you see the intersection between sociology, environment, socioeconomic factors, and neuroscience and pathology. She's also written for the lay public in several ways. I had an article in Scientific American on what inequality does to the brain, and another in an op-ed in the Washington Post, how poverty affects children's brains. Understandably, her work has been deemed meritorious by funding agencies, and she's been funded by the NIH, but probably more significantly, how did you manage to get money from the Gates Foundation? And is that Mark Zuckerberg's wife?
The Chan Zuckerberg. Yeah, it's the two of them together.
Oh, that's her last name. It's hyphenated. I see. So she's her work has been funded by the Gates Foundation, which usually is into infectious diseases, but now is, I guess, seeing the light and understanding that the brain is worth funding as well. So at any rate, and I'm happy to say that a lot of our faculty have already interacted with Dr. Noble and formed collaborations in the interim, but her work is very relevant to what we do, so it's good to have her talking to us today. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Kimberly Noble.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lieberman, for that generous introduction, and good morning, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I have no conflicts of interest. So one of my favorite quotes is that the human brain has been termed the most complex 3 pounds in the universe. And it's not hard to see why when we consider the fact that we're born with 100 billion neurons, and we develop between 250,000 and 500,000 new neurons every minute in the first few months of life. But of course, as we know, most new growth is not actually neurons, but the connections between cells in childhood. Oh, thank you. These synapses between cells become increasingly complex from birth to 3. So I'm showing you here synapses at birth, at 3 months, and at 2 years. And indeed, we form 1,000 trillion synapses in our brain by the age of 3. But what I think is really fascinating is that early experience shapes this brain developmental process. And please feel free to come up if you like. There's a lot of seats up front. So you've likely heard of the use it or lose it phenomenon, whereby neural connections that are used frequently are strengthened, whereas those that are not are dropped or pruned. And it turns out that the brain is most plastic or able to make new connections early in childhood. Now, of course, a child's experience varies tremendously as a function of his or her family's social and economic circumstances. And so we can use socioeconomic factors as a lens through which to better understand early brain plasticity. So a bit of background. What is poverty? So poverty is an income level defined by the federal government that varies by family size and composition, meaning the number of adults and children in the home. So the current federal poverty line for a family with 2 adults and 2 kids is $24,600, and that doesn't vary geographically. So that number is the same here in New York City as it is for a family in rural South Dakota, even though clearly the cost of living in those 2 places is quite different. And as we all know, poverty puts children at risk for a host of negative outcomes in terms of their physical health, mental health, and school achievement, to name a few. And nonetheless, despite the quite low level at which poverty is set and the well-known detrimental outcomes, poverty is quite prevalent, currently affecting more than 1 in 5 children across the US. Now, when I talk about socioeconomic status, or SES, I'm talking about more than just poverty. I just told you that poverty is strictly defined based on family income, whereas SES comprises income, but also circumstances like parents' educational attainment, occupational prestige, and subjective social status, or where one sees oneself on the social hierarchy. And we know that when childhood SES is defined in this way, it tends to be associated with a number of important cognitive developmental outcomes, things like achievement tests, grade retention, literacy, IQ, and school graduation rate, to name a few. And the data that I'm about to show you show that the socioeconomic gap in achievement emerges early in childhood and tends to widen throughout the elementary years. So the data I'm about to show you come from the British cohort study of 1970, which followed tens of thousands of children longitudinally from the UK, from about age 2 to about age 10. Now, of course, as we all know, we're not going to give a 2-year-old the same test as we would give a 10-year-old. So on the y-axis, we have cognitive performance in percentile, or where the children performed relative to other children of the same age. So first, I'm going to draw your attention to children who started out at age 2, performing at the 90th percentile, so outperforming 90% of other 2-year-olds, who happen to come from socioeconomically advantaged homes. Okay? So these children from higher SES homes who were high early scorers tended to perform above average throughout the course of childhood. Next, I'll draw your attention to children who started out at the 10th percentile, so outperforming only 10% of other 2-year-olds, who happen to come from socioeconomically disadvantaged homes. So these kids from lower SES homes who were low early scorers tended to perform below average throughout the course of childhood. So far, nothing I've told you is tremendously surprising. A bit more surprising, though, is what happens when we consider what we might term the crossover groups. So next, let's consider kids who also started out at the 10th percentile at age 2, but who happen to come from socioeconomically advantaged homes. So these children from higher SES homes who were low early scorers actually rose in their relative rank over the course of childhood, so that by age 10, they were performing at or even a little bit above average. And finally, and most disconcertingly, we can consider what happened to those kids who started out outperforming 90% of their 2-year-old peers, but who happened to come from socioeconomically disadvantaged homes. So those kids actually fell in their relative rank over the course of childhood, such that by age 10, family socioeconomic circumstance is a much better predictor of cognitive development than is early cognitive skill. And of course, no one actually lost absolute skill, right? We're talking about percentiles or relative rank relative to same age peers. Okay. So I think this is a particularly stark demonstration of the emergence of socioeconomic disparities in cognition over the course of early to middle childhood. And it really leads to the question as to what factors are contributing to this socioeconomic gap in development. And of course, we can think of many, right? Differences in nutrition, differences in prenatal care or perinatal complications, differences perhaps in prenatal drug exposure or exposure to environmental toxicants like secondhand smoke or lead, differences in the home learning environment or schooling or family stress. And to this laundry list and the many others that you all could likely come up with, I would say yes, really each of these has been shown to contribute in part to the link between socioeconomic status and children's cognitive skill. So how do we make sense of this? Well, one way is to recognize that so-called cognitive skill is really too broad of an outcome, right? Traditional achievement measures like IQ or school graduation aren't specific in terms of brain function. There's no high school graduation nucleus in the brain. So we can be much more specific in asking which particular cognitive skills and corresponding brain circuitry seem to be most strongly associated with socioeconomic factors. And of course, that brings us to a neuroscience approach, as neuroscience teaches us that distinct structures and circuits support different kinds of cognitive skills. And so by bringing a neuroscience approach to this social science question, we can ask which core cognitive and brain systems are most highly associated with SES. And so that's exactly what my collaborators and I set out to do over 10 years ago now, when we recruited several socioeconomically diverse cohorts of children ranging in age from kindergartners on up through adolescence. And our findings were quite similar across these different cohorts, where we found socioeconomic disparities in language skills, as well as more modest but consistent differences in memory and certain aspects of executive function. So building off of this early work, my lab is interested in pursuing 4 main questions that'll be the topic for the remainder of the talk. Number 1, how do these differences in behavior relate to underlying differences in children's brain structure? Number 2, just how early are these socioeconomic disparities detectable? I just told you that the first behavioral studies started out with kindergartners, so if we can detect remarkable differences by kindergarten, surely they're evident before then, but when? Number 3, which experiences, particularly modifiable experiences, might be accounting for these links? And finally, near and dear to all of our hearts, how can this work inform intervention? So we'll touch on each of these topics through the remainder of the talk. Okay, so number 1, how do these differences in children's behavior and cognition relate to underlying differences in brain structure? Well, we first set out to answer this in a study that was published about 6 years ago. So I just told you that we repeatedly found socioeconomic differences in memory. We've known for over 50 years now that memory is heavily reliant on the structure in green, which is the hippocampus. And we've also known for quite some time that in many cases, a larger hippocampus is associated with better memory skill. So we reasoned that perhaps we would find socioeconomic disparities in the size of children's hippocampi. And indeed, that's exactly what we found. And this finding has now been replicated in 4 independent labs. So it's the most commonly reported finding in the literature looking at socioeconomic disparities in brain structure. But what about the rest of the brain? Well, most studies looking at socioeconomic disparities in brain structure have focused on cortical volume. But if you remember from your high school geometry days, volume, if you could imagine the brain being the shape of a soup can, would be the product, the volume would be how much soup it would hold, and the volume would be the product of the height of the soup can, or cortical thickness, times the area of the circle on top, which would be like the cortical surface area. And it turns out that cortical thickness and cortical surface area are controlled by different genes and actually work in opposite directions over the course of development. So our brains, our cortices become progressively thinner, going from a soup can to a tuna fish can, if you will. And the surface areas become progressively larger, so going from like a tomato paste can to a full-fledged can of soup. And so if we're collapsing across cortical thickness and surface area by looking at cortical volume, we're missing some of the nuance there. So a few years ago, I had the good fortune of collaborating with the Pediatric Imaging, Neurocognition, and Genetics, or PING investigators, who recruited a very large sample of over 1,000 children and adolescents ranging in age from 3 to 20, in which their primary aim was to disentangle age-related differences in cortical surface area and cortical thickness. Now, they weren't setting out to ask any questions about socioeconomic circumstance, but fortuitously, this very large sample was recruited from a host of socioeconomically diverse families from 10 cities across the US. So we were able to conduct a secondary data analysis asking whether we would see any associations between parents' educational attainment or family income and these aspects of neuroanatomical structure. And we did this when controlling for covariates like sex, age, and genetic race or ancestry. And so what did we find? So just to orient you, in case anyone's not familiar, this is the front of the brain, this is the back. Again, this is the front of the brain, this is the back, looking straight down the middle. Everywhere you see in color is a point where higher family income was associated with greater cortical surface area at that point when adjusting for covariates. So what you can see is that essentially across most of the cortex, you see this link between family income and children's brain structure. But this link is not the same across all areas. So you see that certain areas, shown in yellow, have a particularly strong relationship, and those are areas like parasylvian cortex and left inferior frontal gyrus that support language development, as well as areas like the anterior cingulate cortex that support executive function development. So the brain structural findings recapitulated what we had found previously in terms of disparities in behavior. Now, a couple important points to note here. This link between family income and children's brain structure was not linear. Indeed, the relationship was strongest among the most disadvantaged families. So that means that dollar for dollar, relatively smaller differences in family income were associated with proportionately greater differences in brain structure. And perhaps that's not so surprising, right? An extra $20,000 for a family making $200,000 is nice, but probably not earth-shattering, whereas an extra $20,000 for a family that was only making $20,000 to start is quite a big difference. Secondly, and this is perhaps the most important thing I'll say today, there was tremendous variation from person to person, so quite a bit of individual variation, meaning that yes, on average across this sample of nearly 1,100 children and adolescents, higher family income was associated with larger brain surface. However, there were plenty of kids from higher income homes who had relatively smaller brain surfaces, plenty of kids from more disadvantaged homes who had relatively larger brain surfaces. So in no way could I know a child's income and know with any certainty what that particular child's brain would look like. Now, I mentioned that we also looked at a different aspect of brain structure, namely cortical thickness. Here we saw a much smaller effect of socioeconomic status. This was work led by my former postdoc, Lucian Piccolo, who's now at SUNY Stony Brook, and Emily Mers, who was trained in the PET program here is now finishing up her postdoc with me and Catherine Monk and is currently on the job market. And so what they found was that, as you would expect with age, we saw decreasing cortical thickness. That's well acknowledged in the literature, but socioeconomic factors moderate that association. So I'm showing you parental education here, although we saw the same pattern with family income, such that among children from the more relatively disadvantaged homes, you saw a steeper age-related decline earlier with a relative leveling off sometime around mid-adolescence, whereas among the children from the more advantaged homes, you saw a relatively shallower age-related slope. And that's consistent with animal literature as well as some human literature, suggesting that perhaps early adversity can actually accelerate development.
Kimberly, do you mind if we ask questions while you're...
No, go ahead.
I'm right here.
Okay, hi.
This is kind of a technical question, but when you do these morphometric socioeconomic comparisons, do you control for any kind of standardizing of the volumetric measure, like intracranial or height or
Yeah,
something?
so if you do something like hippocampal volume, you control for whole brain volume, but the literature does not control for whole brain morphometry when looking at surface-based measures like surface area or cortical thickness.
I mean, the reason I ask is because you could imagine that socioeconomics is associated with like nutrition and things that affect, physical development, which, so the relationship between brain indices and
Sure.
maybe related to that as opposed to some direct, environmental richness or intellectual stimulation.
Sure, so we're gonna be looking in a few moments at some factors that we think are involved in accounting for these differences. We haven't explored nutrition yet, although that's something that we will be exploring in the coming years. And I should say, in this study, we aren't really able to do that because we don't have information about, rich information at least, about the experiences that the families were involved in. Okay. Now, you might ask, does it matter, right? Okay, so you see socioeconomic differences in the size and shape of children's brains, but who cares? You can't see their brain, right? So does it reflect anything real that we would care about? So we think so. So in the Ping study, we found that these brain structural differences partially accounted for socioeconomic differences in executive function. Work by other labs suggests that difference in brain structure accounts for anywhere between 15 and 44% of the income achievement gap. So we think we're onto something here, and now the question is why, as Dr. Lieberman was alluding to. Okay, so turning to the second question, just how early are these effects detectable? So spoiler alert, in terms of behavioral development, we seem to be able to detect effects sometime in the second year of life. For brain development, we seem to be able to detect effects towards the end of the first year of life. So now let me show you a little bit of data to back that up. So this was a study that we conducted a few years ago in collaboration with Bill Pfeiffer in his past cohort in South Dakota, in which we followed a group of children longitudinally from 9 to 15 months, and then another group from 15 to 21 months. Again, these were children from socioeconomically diverse homes. Here I'm showing you children of the most educated parents in blue, of the middle educated parents in the sample in red, and of the least educated parents in green. Again, to equalize across different skill levels from 9 to 21 months. Here I'm showing you a language composite in Z-scores, so a score of 0 means that they're performing at the mean for that age. And so what you can see is that from 9 to 15 months, we're not really seeing the emergence of socioeconomic disparities in language development just yet. But between 15 and 21 months, what we're seeing is that children from the more highly educated parents are rising to the top of the distribution, whereas unfortunately children from the less educated parents are falling to the bottom of the distribution. And that difference at 21 months between the blue and green lines is not just statistically significant, but clinically significant as well, equivalent to about 0.8 standard deviations, which is equivalent in magnitude to about 12 IQ points. Now again, we weren't doing an IQ test, we were doing a composite of language measures, but it nonetheless gives you a sense of just how large the disparities already are before children even turn 2. And the pattern was the same for memory development. So by 21 months of age, we see about 0.8 standard deviations of difference between children of the most highly educated parents compared to children of the least highly educated parents in the sample. So that's the study that we did to look at socioeconomic disparities in behavior early on, but what about getting under the hood a bit to try to measure brain functional disparities? So the pictures I showed you before, of course, we're using MRI, which is great for adults and older kids, not so great for younger kids, although of course there's some excellent work going on here looking at MRI in infancy. Still in toddlers, I would say it's pretty challenging. So instead, we typically pull out another tool in the toolkit, namely electroencephalogram or EEG, which I'm sure you're all familiar with its use in detecting seizures. Some of you may be less familiar with its use looking at cognitive development. So just a bit of a primer. With EEG, we can measure the electrical activity of the brain by placing electrodes on the scalp and then amplifying the signal, and then decomposing the signal into oscillations that occur in different frequency bands that look like this. Broadly speaking, kids who are at risk for problems in school tend to exhibit an excess of low-frequency oscillations and a relative deficit of high-frequency oscillations. So we can look at the relative proportions of these different frequency bands to understand something about children's cognition early on before they can tell us. So one of my former postdocs, Dr. Natalie Brito, who also trained here, she was an RWJ scholar and then a Sackler Fellow, then got a K99 and since has moved on to a tenure track position at NYU. So Natalie was interested in really pushing the envelope and saying just how early might we be able to detect socioeconomic differences in brain function? What if we looked in the first several days of life? So in collaboration with Bill Pfeiffer, we looked at EEG signal within the first several days of life and asked whether either parent's education or family income was associated with differences in resting brain function at birth. And the answer was a resounding no. So there was absolutely no evidence for any association between parents' education or family income in any frequency band anywhere across the scalp. Now, it wasn't the case that resting brain function didn't have any variability at birth. Quite the contrast. You can see that there was quite a bit of individual difference. It just wasn't explained by socioeconomic circumstance. Now, you might say, okay, well, maybe there's variability, but maybe that's all just noise, right? Who knows what neonates are thinking about or what their resting brain function means. So that doesn't seem to be the case either, because the differences in resting brain function within the first few days of life did predict 15-month cognitive development. So it's not that this signal is meaningless, it's just not predicted by socioeconomic factors straight out of the gate. However, in a different sample that we're currently collecting data from in my lab, by the end of the first year, so sometime between 6 and 12 months of life, we are seeing socioeconomic differences with children from more advantaged homes having more of the so-called good high-frequency power in frontal distributions. So certainly, while not conclusive, it's at least supportive of the notion that socioeconomic disparities may emerge as a result of differences in postnatal experience. Okay, so if we're right and postnatal experience may play a role here, again, we can ask which particular experiences might explain these differences. So I showed you this slide earlier. Two experiences that we're particularly interested in my lab are the home language environment and family stress. So allow me to present you a theoretical model in which I show you what I think may be going on and then some data to support that. So the model goes like this. We know that there are socioeconomic differences in the home language environment, meaning the quality and quantity of language that kids hear in the home. In turn, we believe that the home language environment is likely critical in shaping the development of parts of the brain that support language in the left hemisphere. Simultaneously and relatively independently in the literature, there's a good deal of evidence suggesting socioeconomic differences in family stress. And we know that stress has cascading effects on certain neural structures, such as the hippocampus, which supports memory, as well as prefrontal limbic circuitry that supports cognitive and emotional regulation. So this model has been, sort of underscored a lot of our empirical work in the last several years. So let me first walk you through the top arm of the model. What can I tell you about socioeconomic differences in the home language environment? These data are from a seminal study by Hart and Risley, who in the mid-90s performed a longitudinal study in which they followed families longitudinally for the first several years of life. Every month they went into these families' homes and for an hour or two tape recorded every word, or tape recorded what the children heard and said. They then brought their tape recorders back to the lab where some poor research assistant had to transcribe every word that they heard and every word that they spoke. And what Hart and Risley reported was that at every age, the kids from the more advantaged homes tended to hear more words than the kids from the less advantaged homes. And so extrapolating that out over every waking hour over the first few years of their lives, Hart and Risley calculated that this amounted to a 30 million word gap in terms of the number of words heard by the kids of the more advantaged families compared to the kids of the less advantaged families. Subsequent work showed that it wasn't just the number of words heard that varied across families, but also the complexity and responsiveness of verbal interactions. And subsequent work to that showed that the number of words children heard was directly related to their vocabulary size. Now, a few minutes ago, I showed you that one of the areas where we see the greatest socioeconomic differences in brain structure are in regions that support children's language development. And so we reasoned that perhaps differences in the home language environment may explain socioeconomic differences in these brain regions. Now, we have it a little bit easier than Hart and Risley and their poor research assistants. We're able to use this device, which is known as the LENA, or Language Environment Analysis Tool. It's a small digital recorder that fits into specialized clothing that the child wears, and that then automatically records up to 16 hours of the home language environment. The families then hopefully give us the LENA device back. We upload the data, and the software automatically analyzes the number of adult words the child heard, the number of vocalizations the child made, as well as the number of conversational turns or back and forth responsive interactions between the target child and an adult. And work led by my postdoc, Emily Mers, who's on the job market, is showing that indeed more conversational turns is associated with a larger left perisylvian cortex, so this part of the brain that's known to support language and reading development. The relationship was here for adult word count as well, but it was stronger for hourly conversational turns, suggesting that it really is something about the conversational or responsive nature of verbal interactions and not just the number of words heard that might be driving this effect. This difference in brain structure partially explains socioeconomic disparities in reading skill. And importantly, and I think very interestingly, there was no link between brain structure in this region and children's vocalizations. So it doesn't seem to be the case that chattier children have larger brains and are just engendering more conversation from their parents. The data really are more consistent with this notion that conversation is driving brain and subsequent behavior. And indeed, this difference in brain structure partially mediated links between hourly conversational turns and reading skills. Okay, so now what can I tell you about the bottom arm of the model? So certainly socioeconomic disadvantage is associated with greater family stress in terms of limitations of material resources, sometimes chaos in the home or exposure to violence. And we know that when parents are depressed or distracted, family life is much more likely to be characterized by conflict and emotional withdrawal rather than the kind of warm and nurturing and supportive parenting that we know is so important for children. Now, we and others have reported that socioeconomically disadvantaged children may have altered levels of stress hormones like cortisol, and a great deal of both animal and human work has suggested that there are certain regions of the brain, certain circuits that are particularly sensitive to cortisol, including the hippocampus and prefrontal limbic circuitry. And so we've reasoned that perhaps these differences in chronic stress might explain socioeconomic differences in brain structure. The way we're operationalizing chronic stress here is using hair cortisol. It's a sort of nice way to measure cortisol because cortisol is chronically secreted into hair, and so with one sample that we can obtain in the lab, we get sort of an average measure of cortisol over the last several months. It's much less methodologically fraught than salivary cortisol, which varies diurnally, so varies over the course of the day, even sometimes the day of the week. So typically, researchers have to take a number of different measurements over different days. So what are we finding? So we are finding socioeconomic differences in hair cortisol as we would predict. This is work led by Alexandra Osaki, who was my former postdoc and is now at NYU Med. So children of more highly educated parents have lower levels of hair cortisol. That's true for family income as well. And then work led by Emily is showing, that children with higher levels of hair cortisol in turn have a smaller hippocampus, as we would predict. And interestingly, the area of the hippocampus that's driving this are the CA3 and dentate gyri, which is exactly what we would have predicted based on the animal literature looking at stress. We're also finding that higher child hair cortisol is associated with increased anterior cingulate thickness. And this hair cortisol measure is partially accounting for links between socioeconomic factors and hippocampal volume. So, so far I've presented a model whereby socioeconomic disparities in children's experience seem to explain differences in brain and subsequent behavior. And so if we're right and experience matters, it begs the question as to whether this work can inform interventions, and if so, what's the right level at which to intervene? So certainly we can imagine intervening at the level of cognition itself, most commonly through school-based interventions. Certainly the school-based interventions represent the most common form of intervention aimed at addressing socioeconomic disparities in achievement. In many cases, results can be very promising, but as any intervention scientist will tell you, school-based interventions are labor-intensive and costly if done right. They also often suffer from something known as fade out, which is the idea that if you measure differences immediately after the cessation of the intervention, you may find effects, but then if you go back into the school 6 months or a year or 5 years later, often those differences fade away. Now, it's not to say that the intervention was not effective, but it does suggest that perhaps longer interventions and therefore more labor-intensive and costlier interventions might be necessary. And finally, I would suggest that while I would be the last person to deny the critical importance of high-quality early childhood education, if we're waiting until children start formal schooling, we're probably waiting too late. Right? I already told you that we see remarkable socioeconomic disparities in cognition by the time children turn 2. So what about taking a step back, trying to change experience, which happens most commonly through parenting interventions? So parenting interventions are traditionally home-based. Again, there's a number of excellent examples of parenting interventions that can be effective. But again, as the interventionists who tirelessly try to implement these interventions will tell you, they tend to be labor-intensive and costly if done right. And in addition to challenges surrounding fade-out, parenting interventions are particularly susceptible to challenges around uptake, getting parents to actually enroll, as well as attrition, trying to prevent them from dropping out. Right? To some extent, if you're implementing an intervention in a school, you've sort of got a captive audience, whereas with parents, particularly in early childhood, you're much less likely to have an infrastructure kind of binding them to your intervention, so it's much more difficult to get that kind of buy-in. And finally, I would say, it's one thing to implement an intervention in a few dozen or 100 people who maybe you bring into your lab, once a week for 8 weeks. It's quite another to imagine scaling interventions up to the community level or beyond. Again, not to say it can't happen. There's some excellent examples like nurse-family partnership, for example, that certainly have been scaled up, but it's challenging and costly. So finally, I'd like to draw your attention, and apologies for the typo there, to considering intervening at what I'm terming the most distal level by changing socioeconomic status itself. So I will preface this by saying that correlational work by my social scientist colleagues has suggested that small income differences are associated with big outcome differences. So for example, a difference in $4,000 between in annual income between the prenatal year and age 2 is associated with some pretty dramatic differences down the road. So increased adult earnings when those kids grow up, increased time spent in the labor force, as well as some evidence for improved health in adulthood. However, that evidence is correlational, as is all of the evidence I've presented to you today. So we really have to ask ourselves whether it's possible to move beyond correlation and really try to understand whether income is causing these differences, right? There are many people who would say, well, it's not poverty, it's character or your ability to pull yourself up from your bootstraps. And we could counter that and say, well, babies don't really have bootstraps. But until we actually do the study, it's pretty difficult to stand firm. And so I'm really delighted to be one of the principal investigators on the Baby's First Year study, which is the first clinical trial of poverty reduction in early childhood. My other PIs are Greg Duncan, who's a renowned economist at UC Irvine, Catherine Magnuson, who's an expert in social policy at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Lisa Janetian, who is a behavioral economist at NYU, Hiro Yoshikawa is a community and developmental psychologist at NYU, and I'm heading up the neuroscience piece of this study. So what are we actually proposing to do or doing? So we are recruiting 1,000 low-income mothers from about 10 hospitals around the country shortly after they give birth. And all participants are randomized to receive an unconditional cash transfer, meaning cash that they can spend any way that they would like. they'll be getting this cash every month on the anniversary of their child's birthday for the first 40 months of their children's lives, so just past when their kids turn 3. And the mothers are randomized to either being in the treatment group that gets $333 a month, which amounts to $4,000 a year, or the control group, which gets $20 a month or $240 a year. The difference between those groups is roughly the amount of the earned income tax credit. It's also the amount that I mentioned earlier that social science has suggested is probably large enough to move the needle. So it's both a policy relevant amount and what we think is likely to be a clinically relevant amount. So upon enrollment in the study, moms get a preloaded activated debit card, and that debit card automatically reloads every month. And so in this way, we'll be able to track the causal impact of poverty reduction on children's cognitive, emotional, and brain development over the first 3 years of life, when we believe that the developing brain is likely most malleable to financial experience. So what are we actually measuring? So at baseline, we're conducting a survey to understand family life. Then we're following up the families annually. So at ages 1 and 2, we'll be conducting a home visit in which we implement a survey, observe and video record parenting practices, measure stress physiology, and brief measures of cognitive development. And then at age 3, we'll be bringing the families into the labs to really conduct in-depth assessments of the children, looking at their cognitive, emotional, and brain development in a standardized way. The study has been funded by NIH and a consortium of foundations, including Gates. And I'm happy to say that we launched recruitment in May of this year. So we've recruited something on the order of 150 moms so far out of our 1,000. So how do we think this income is likely to affect family life? Well, we've got 2 main pathways that we're theorizing. One, we might term the increased investment pathway. And so this is the idea that with more financial resources, moms are likely to be able to afford more books and toys, perhaps more highly nutritious foods, better quality childcare, maybe better housing in better neighborhoods. And then the other pathway we're terming the reduced stress pathway. So this is the idea that if moms are less worried about how they're going to make their monthly rent check or keep the lights on, they're more likely to have the bandwidth to be able to engage with their children in warm and nurturing ways. Now, chances are both of these pathways are in play, and they may vary somewhat from one family to the next. So our ultimate outcomes of interest have to do with the children. We conducted a pilot study in my lab back when it was up here at CUMC in 2014, and happily found that giving out cash seems to be highly feasible. I say that facetiously, but you never know. So we recruited 30 moms who gave birth here at NYP. We had over 93% retention over the course of the 1-year pilot, and importantly, very few problems with debit card implementation, even though this was the first time ever using a debit card for over 1 in 5 of the moms in the pilot. We also, as part of the pilot, conducted a qualitative interview to try to understand, how, if at all, this money seemed to affect families. And the moms really told us that even in small amounts, the money seemed to make a big difference. So one mom told us, believe it or not, even an extra $20 helps. There were times I found myself completely broke. I go and I use it, and that means I can make it for another week. And another mom said, the money from the card really, really helped me out, especially one month that we didn't have the food stamps. We didn't have anything at all. Now, most moms in the pilot told us that they were using the money for the baby, but because it's a debit card, we don't have to take mom's word for it. We can actually track their transactions. And so the point of this slide is not for you to examine each of the 1,112 transactions that took place over the course of the pilot year, though I do like to point out that exactly 3 of those transactions occurred at a liquor store. Now, clearly a pilot study of 30 moms isn't powered to be able to look at the kinds of questions we're ultimately interested in the larger study of 1,000 children. Nonetheless, despite the small sample size, patterns on the order of a half a standard deviation suggested higher center-based childcare expenditures in the treatment group, more frequent reports of mother-child activities, less reports of household chaos, and parenting stress. And so the question remains as to whether boosting family income can change children's trajectories for the better. When we compare the United States to our developed country peers, the size of public spending on children and families is really quite low. But it doesn't have to be this way. So if we look at poverty rates over time for seniors in blue compared to children in red, we see very different patterns. So back in the late 50s, over 1 in 3 senior citizens were living in poverty. But because of social services like Social Security and Medicare, that number has steadily fallen so that now fewer than 10% of senior citizens are living in poverty. For children back in the late 50s, 27% of kids were living in poverty. Now, the number did go down somewhat with the advent of Medicaid, but because focusing or spending on disadvantaged children or families with young kids has not traditionally been a priority, that number has steadily crept back up to the 1 in 5 I told you about at the beginning of the talk. So we believe that this study has the potential to provide direct evidence of the effects of poverty reduction on the developing brain and mind. And we're hopeful that it will inform debates on the generosity or cuts both to existing social service programs as well as potential new programs that affect the lives of millions of families with young children. So existing programs that could potentially be affected by the results include things like food stamps, housing vouchers, as well as paid family leave or the minimum wage, which are often hotly contested on Capitol Hill. So while I would never suggest that income is the only or even the most important factor in brain development, it may be the most manipulable from a policy perspective. So if you're interested in hearing more about the RCT, I encourage you to follow me on Twitter. And many thanks to my lab, collaborators, and funders. And I'm happy to take questions.
Kimberly, thank you for that wonderful presentation and really for your focusing on this important area of work. I'm going to start off just with 2 quick questions. One is that what do critical periods of development come in? Have you been able to sort of cone down to look at whether socioeconomic factors have greater impact at this? And the other is presumably genetic or constitutional factors which predispose people to resilience or to illness vulnerability interact with the environment and the socioeconomic status of families that children are reared in, which adds to the complexity of the whole thing.
Yeah.
But I wondered if you've begun to integrate that into your work.
Yeah, no, so they're great questions. So to answer the second one first, whether genetics or constitutional differences might be accounting for length. So certainly, right? I mean, not everybody can grow up to be a Harvard physicist, and I don't think anyone would reasonably suggest otherwise. However, there's quite a bit of evidence from the behavioral genetics world to suggest that not everyone is able to live up to his or her genetic potential. And so I think that's where a study like this comes into play. We just recently received funding to be able to look at epigenetics, which I didn't include on that slide, but we are going to be able to look at epigenetic differences likely when children are 2 to be able to see whether gene expression varies as a function of the cash gift. Obviously, we're not going to be changing anyone's genes, but we might change the expression of genes similar to other studies that reduce adversity. And then your first question.
I had to do with critical periods of development.
Yeah, so the short answer is we, of course, don't really know, right? When we looked in the pain data, we didn't see obvious socioeconomic by age interactions with surface area at all, and we saw small ones with cortical surface that I showed you. Now that effect was certainly dwarfed by the main effect of age.
Hey, yes.
Just building on your question, but I was just curious about, with regard to protective factors to potentially buffer, assuming SES is constant and we don't have these, other interventions, influencing those investments in those families, what protective factors, in the research or any longitudinal research that have been identified that can potentially buffer against the impact on cognitive development?
Yeah, so work by Jane Waldvogel and others who's here at the School of Social Work has suggested quite strongly that parenting is probably the #1 factor, that predicts outcomes, right? So over and above socioeconomic differences. So I think parenting is likely to buffer against economic disadvantage in many cases, but in some cases material resources or the time parents have to spend with children ends up being so compromised that even in a warm parenting situation, there can be difficulties.
Jeremy.
So, Kim, wonderful talk. Big fan of you and your work. Thank you. One thing that always strikes me when I see this design, there isn't an alternative way to do it, is you can't separate disparity from resources, meaning disparity, comparing oneself against what one sees around one, contributes to stress, contributes to poor outcomes. And it's really difficult in this design to separate that. And I wonder if you could comment on that challenge, but also whether there's other data out there that let you compare the impact of lack of resources versus the impact of disparity in contrast with your surrounding.
There is a little. So some work by people like Nancy Adler and others has looked at subjective social status. And often people find that subjective social status, or where you see yourself on the hierarchy, explains outcomes over and above objective measures like education and income. There's work by Pete Gianaros at Pitt that has shown that in looking at brain structure. So there is likely something to what you're suggesting about this sort of subjective sense of disparity relative to others. Also work by Leah Fernalds in Madagascar informs this to an extent. So Madagascar is a very poor country. GDP is like a couple $100s. And yet she was able to recruit, I think, a sample of around 1,000 kids who, although they were all poor by our standards, nonetheless showed disparities. So she was able to look at quintiles of wealth in Madagascar, and she found many of the same disparity, all of the same disparities really, that we've reported in US kids. So particularly focused on language, memory, and executive function. So I think the answer is probably both. And then, you'd have to really do an experimental design to try to tease those apart, which would be hard, but maybe not impossible.
Alex, and then this gentleman who's seated in the high-price seats.
I'm wondering if there's a way that you could actually get to have a little bit of a better picture of whether the differences in imaging actually mediate the effect of SES on cognitive outcomes. And the thing that comes to mind is if you take your two crossover groups and within them look at, since your variance is actually pretty high in both measures, if you can look whether within the crossover groups the imaging differences co-vary with the cognitive differences, and whether that would be a way to get at that.
Yeah, that's a great idea. So the crossover that I presented early on, was a longitudinal study over about 10 years with like 10,000 kids. So there's always the confound or the question of how to pay for imaging in a large longitudinal study. But in theory, that kind of design would teach us quite a bit.
I had a
Yes.
question. First, I wanted to confirm you're giving the paychecks. You're
Stand up
giving
while
the
you're
pay
talking.
on the.
You must stand up while you're talking, if you can get up. Will somebody help that guy up?
Sorry.
You're giving it monthly on the day of the birth.
Yes.
I was curious to hear your thoughts about the choice of that as opposed to the beginning of the month, the end of the month, maybe 5 days before the end of the month.
Yeah.
You
It's
made a
great
comment
question.
about like making ends meet at the end of the month.
Absolutely. So we've had quite a bit of discussion about this, actually. I should say this study has been in the planning stages for over 6 years now. I was on maternity leave with my eldest when we first started planning it, and she just started first grade last week. And you might imagine the economists went round and round on that question, and also whether we should give it as an annual lump sum versus a monthly amount. So in terms of that question, the data would suggest that a lump sum tends to lead to large purchases like a washing machine, whereas monthly disbursements tend to lead to sort of more basic financial expenditures like rent and utilities. And then in terms of tying it to the child's day of their birthday, there's no great way to say that, it was for a couple of reasons. So one, while it's completely unconditional and unconstrained and they can spend it on whatever they want, it's sort of a behavioral economics nudge to tie it at least a little bit to the child, which of course is very broadly defined, right? I mean, certainly rent is for the child too. And then secondly, the economists are very interested in a certain statistical technique that essentially doing it randomly, which tying it to the child's birthday allows you to do, which means that it's called an instrumental variable technique, and it allows you to vary across the sample whether people get it at the beginning of the month or the end of the month or close to their food stamp disbursement or not. And so we'll actually be able to look at differences as a result of that. So it was intentionally done by my very smart economist colleagues.
Katie, did you have someone back there, or no? Yes, Beatrice. Is that Beatrice?
My pleasure.
So I didn't notice in your most recent baby talk, in your most recent baby grant, you didn't notice any measures in the middle of the first year. Is that right? So you're filming the parents starting at 1 year? So for example.
For the RCT. That's right. Yeah, we
Yeah.
would love to do more data collection, but it's already a $15 million study that we've been scraping together for 6 years. So
Right.
the first follow-up data collection will happen when the children are 1,
Right.
unfortunately.
So, I mean, I'm sure you're aware, like Annie Bernier has a study showing that infant brain development is already predicted from the quality of maternal care at 4 months, 5 months. So the middle of that first year predicts tremendously in development. So
Yeah,
it's just a vote for an earlier assessment.
yeah, no, I would also vote for that.
Thanks again, if I didn't say that before. I guess I'm just wondering from a neuropsychological perspective, when we're evaluating kids, especially with our population here in Washington Heights, how does a kid who maybe early on looked like their cognitive functioning would be, let's say, within or above normal limits, and who declined, like you showed in one of your graphs, look differently from a kid who grew up in a high income, situation and has now developed like a language-based learning disability? And is there a way for us to account for those differences, and how much is, attributed to lower SES and those associated factors versus other neurodevelopmental issues that are going on? We have some ways of looking at, or starting to look at, cultural linguistic impacts. Is there any way of looking at impact of SES and those other variables?
Yeah, so it's a very cutting edge question and we don't have a lot of data on it. We did one paper a while ago now that looked at kids who struggled with reading in the context of limited access to resources versus kids who struggled despite plentiful access to resources. And as you might imagine, their brains did look different. So the kids who struggled in the context of limited access to resources had sort of typical looking brain development, whereas the kids who struggled despite access to resources had more atypical looking brain development. That said, so if we get to a point where brain imaging becomes a reasonable screening tool to kind of put kids on the path to different interventional approaches, that would be terrific. But I would hesitate to use socioeconomic factors as a litmus test to provide intervention, right?
Catherine?
Thanks, Kim, for such a great talk.
Pleasure.
Just one comment, because I myself am repeatedly shocked by this fact, which I'm sure you know well, and that's the percent of births in this country on Medicaid. 50% of births in this country are women on Medicaid. So I think it really emphasizes the importance of the work that you're doing.
And thank you. And what's fascinating, I think, is that Medicaid eligibility varies tremendously as a function of where you live. So here in New York, you can be 400% of the poverty line, so really making a pretty good income and still qualify for health care for your child, for state-paid health care. But in a place like Nebraska, that number is 58% of the poverty line, so you can make $20,000 for a family of 4 and not qualify for health care.
Sorry. Even in New York, the actual dollars
Yeah,
for
the poverty
a family
line, but for
four.
getting Medicaid, then you could make like up to 100.
Is it
'cause
up
it's
to 100?
400,000. 400% of poverty line gets Medicaid here.
Yeah, all right, but the poverty line is still $26K a
Yes,
year, I
right,
think, for a
absolutely,
family
yeah.
of 4, so it's,
Right, no, the poverty line itself is set quite low. It's what, the agencies do with that number that varies.
All right, well, I'm going to come over to the side, but I just I've been waiting for the opportunity to interject this theme into the discussion. So the work you're doing is incredibly important and innovative. It's also potentially highly controversial because it involves policy implications and ultimately, something that some people might call social engineering, for the betterment of the population and society. I wondered if you've had to contend with that yet.
A bit, yeah. So certainly, as you can imagine, sort of pitching the study for fundraising purposes, we've sat around a number of boardrooms, and there have been people who've said, "You want us to use our money for what now?" In terms of sort of conversations with politicians or policymakers, we had a number of stakeholders who are following the study quite closely. Certainly, there are people who would say that in today's political climate, you would never get federal legislation passed as a result of whatever the outcomes might be. Perhaps that's true. However, there are state and local governments that are following the study quite closely as well, including New York City Hall, where there has been discussion about a child allowance very similar to what we're proposing here. So I think that it is likely that if there are policy ramifications, they're likely to get rolled out in blue states first, and then sort of see what happens with the families.
Do you have, I mean, I don't want to take you out of the world of research and the ivory tower, but do you have any plans to, or have you have any discussions with people who do this kind of thing professionally, communications, government relations, these kinds of strategists for how to deal with that eventually?
Yeah, no, we've talked about getting involved with a firm who does that kind of messaging, and so that's sort of one of the things on our agenda. And we also have, friends of the study from different policy arenas who are following along quite closely and who are ready to give us tips when we're ready to disseminate.
I see Bill and Scott and two people. Okay, let's go in that order. So starting with Bill, then Scott, then the row behind, okay?
Thanks. It's a wonderful idea and very modern. What if you enriched, have there been sufficient, similarly sophisticated studies of enriching the environment rather than the...
Sure. That would be great. So we've often sort of talked about pipe dreams. If we had limitless resources, what a third arm would look like, comparing it to some kind of parenting intervention. The problem is the financial constraint of the resources for the study, and then also what intervention would you pick? Certainly you could imagine lots of things that would perhaps have equal or greater impact. They typically would be harder to implement, right? So, IRBs and credentialing to get into the hospitals aside, it's relatively straightforward to enroll moms into this kind of study, and then the implementation kind of takes care of itself. It's much more challenging to implement any kind of parenting intervention or home environmental enrichment intervention. So it's not to say that if you could do it well and with excellent fidelity, you wouldn't find a greater impact. But if you have to think about the public health impact, it kind of has to be, the uptake times the efficacy. And so even if the efficacy is relatively small, the uptake is going to be nearly universal, whereas, those numbers might be flipped in a different kind of more hands-on intervention.
Is there any reason to think that early childhood income supplementation will have less fade out than other interventions like Head Start or whatever?
We don't really know, right? Greg Duncan, the lead economist on the team, is hoping that we'll be able to, continue to raise funds so that at age 3, perhaps we could re-randomize. So then we would actually be able to look at what the impacts are from birth to 3, 3 to 6, both or neither. One thing at a time, but perhaps we'll be able to.
Steve, and then the young lady beside him.
Thank you. Just a quick technical financial question.
Sure.
Is the $20,000 that the people receiving, what are the tax consequences?
I'm so glad you asked. So it's not $20,000, it's $4,000 a year. So this is a big part of what's taken 6 years to implement. So I guess the bird's eye view of this question is that if we give people money and then it gets heavily taxed, or worse, they lose their social service benefits as a result, right? That's known as governmental clawback, because you give people something and then the government claws it back. Ethically, that would be problematic, and then obviously scientifically, that would be a terrible design because we wouldn't really be doing anything. So a big part of what's taken so long to get the study off the ground is dealing with those kind of clawback issues. So in terms of the one you asked about taxation, we spent a while talking with a tax consulting agency who determined that our payments meet the legal definition of a gift because we're not asking for anything in return. So we don't give them the money contingent on enrolling or continuing to participate in the study. What happens is that moms are approached about participating in a longitudinal study of child development and family life. If they're interested, they'll do a baseline survey, get paid for their time today. They hear about the subsequent waves of data collection. So they enroll in this longitudinal study, and only then, once they're consented and complete the baseline survey, do they learn about the cash gift, which they have the choice to enroll in or not. And it's made clear that they can drop out of the research and still get the cash gift subsequently. So because of all of that, it was determined that we meet the legal definition of a gift, which is not taxed by, the recipient is never taxed for a gift. Above, I think, $15,000 a year now, the giver would be taxed, but we're not going that high.
Also, the second part is a question. The people getting the money, it's almost the equivalent of winning a lottery, that they're getting this money and then they choose how to spend it the way they want to spend it. Possibly you could expand the whole scope of your understanding of winning a lottery by looking at people who are low socioeconomic who have actually won a lottery and compare them to a group of people who buy lottery tickets and never win the lottery.
You
and
could, but
you wouldn't have to spend any money on this. All you'd have to do is track people
A small end,
over
though.
a period of
Yeah,
time.
I don't know if you could find 1,000 families that,
Well,
need
there's a
that.
lot of lotteries across the country. We're not talking about huge sums of money. You're talking about 20,000, not about several million.
So it's an interesting thought, trying to track them down. If I could just say, to answer the other aspect of clawback, to ensure that people don't lose things like food stamps or Medicaid, in 2 of the 4 cities we're working in, we actually got legislation passed saying that for these moms, for this study, this money won't count in determining their benefits. And in the other 2 cities, we've gone agency by agency to secure the waivers.
So the lady in a minute, and then Susan, and then Jay, and then we'll come back to,
Have you looked at parental psychiatric illness or wider family history of psychiatric illness in your studies? And specifically, have you looked at the percentage of psychiatric illness in the 3 strata, socioeconomic or income, higher, middle, and lower? And have you factored out and looked at the subpopulations with and without psychiatric illness in terms of their brain development and outcome?
Sure. Okay. So in the clinical trial that we're doing now, one of our primary hypothesized outcomes is maternal mental health. So we are going to be looking at that to see whether the cash gifts affect mental health in the ways that you would imagine. In terms of our past correlational work, we've done a little bit of work looking at that. So for example, socioeconomic differences in parents' hair cortisol partially accounted for socioeconomic differences in, I think it was depression, possibly depression and anxiety, I can't remember. But we've not done the last thing you've asked about looking differentially with people with a family history or not. In our past work, I'm not sure we would have the power to do that. Potentially in the RCT you could. Thanks.
Susan? When you have the microphone?
No, I'm okay. I just wanted to say that.
There you go.
It's here anyway.
I just wanted to say that when I heard the study, I was just so horrified to think that socioeconomic difference, is sort of in your brain by such a young age. And of course, as a psychoanalyst listening to it, my immediate question was, well, what's on those hours worth of tape that you've collected in the home of those Lena interventions? Like, how are the parents talking to the children? Are they talking about feelings? How often are they talking about feelings? So it really immediately brings to mind a lot of psychoanalytic ideas about, about personality development and, parenting. And so I'm really happy that we've been able to give you guys a little bit of seed money just to take a look at what's on those tapes.
Yeah, and thank you for mentioning that. So I didn't present that today because we just,
just
we have a
started it, I know.
graduate student who just started looking at this, but actually transcribing the Lena data to code for different aspects of parental warmth.
Jay?
I just wanted to see if you could talk a little bit more about this fade-out effect, because I've often had there's conflicting ideas. I mean, there was this idea that Head Start, great idea, pre-K, great idea, but the effects fade out over time. But then you have people like Raj Chetty, who seems to be taking this long view that shows, that just having the right kindergarten teacher can, pay millions of dollars in societal benefits. And I just wonder if sometimes with this fade-out effect, we're not measuring the right thing. We're
I
not
think that's right.
capturing whatever it is that's important about these early interventions. Because my understanding is if you look at pre-K and Head Start in terms of longer-term outcomes, you can find the effects,
Absolutely.
but you can't find them in terms of the, short-term things that we're measuring. And I just thought maybe you had some thoughts.
Yeah,
about
no,
that.
I'm sure it depends from one intervention to the next. Head Start, for those who aren't aware, is federally funded preschool for low-income families. And so Head Start's been sort of the poster child for people who say that early intervention is not worth it because you see IQ effects early on, and then a few years later, those IQ effects fade away. And so why did you bother spending the money to send these kids to preschool? But what Jay is talking about is that if you then look down the road, you do see differences in things like school graduation rates. And in fact, just looking at criminal behavior, the reduction in criminal behavior alone pays for Head Start. So, so economics-wise, it's kind of a no-brainer. And certainly you could imagine down the road looking at cost-benefit analysis, economics kinds of questions with this, right? Does a $4,000 financial shock early on pay dividends to society down the road? It's certainly plausible. Oh, but then fade out, yeah.
But I mean, I just wonder, do you have any ideas of what we could be measuring in the near term that would take away some of the ammunition from the naysayers who say this is all a waste of money?
It's hard, right? Because, I mean, you can look at things like special education rates. It's really hard because the things that we have to measure are about immediate cognitive development. And if those, fade out, then it's hard to even convince people to give you the money to follow up these kids longer term.
Yeah. I mean, one just sociologic political observations. I came from Kansas, so I have a lot of very conservative friends. And it just seems to me the sticking point is everybody wants to help children.
Right.
If the parents didn't get some sort of ancillary benefit by proxy. If they could punish the parents and help the children, they could be happy to do it. But no matter how much I explained to them, I mean, I said, you can't do one without the other. You have to.
No, it's the classic, stereotype of the welfare queen who collects checks and isn't deserving of them. And so I think and I hope that by reframing the question around the children who are the future of society, perhaps it changes the conversation a little bit, coupled perhaps with cost-benefit economics analyses. It's a very libertarian approach, really.
David, we're going to get to you in a second. I just want to interject a follow-up on Jay's questions. Courtesy of a donor, we have established under the Child Psychiatry Division's auspices a program called PROMISE Project, which basically screens for learning disabilities in school-age children in northern Manhattan, which finds a high prevalence, not surprisingly. And more broadly, it seems that there's a pretty high population frequency of what may be called pediatric cognitive disorders of whatever origin, circumstantial, genetic. And if you then also look at the correctional system, where adults have an increasing number of inmates who have mental disorders, and you look at juvenile correctional systems, they have a large proportion, not mental disorders, but cognitive disabilities. So the question is do you have the resolution in your data to determine not just generic cognitive function, but individuals that might have diagnosable learning, dyslexia, ADHD, et cetera?
So in our correlational data to date, not really. In the RCT, perhaps, if we follow the longer term. But Amy Margolis is putting together an R1 to ask the kinds of questions you're talking about in the PROMISE clinic, looking at how socioeconomic factors interact with reading developments and other outcomes.
Just getting back to the policy issue, Jay quotes what I guess was a stunning success of research influencing policy with the data on lead, right? Showing the effect that lead has had in the resulted in them removing it from gasoline, paint, and so forth and so on. At any rate, we have big hopes for your study, too.
Thank you.
The other thing I just wanted to ask was that there's also nutritional supplementation during pregnancy. That's folic acid. Bob Friedman in Colorado is beginning a project using choline supplementation as a strategy to potentially prevent schizophrenia. Is that something that sort of enters in your scope of?
Yeah, it's very interesting. So, the RCT at least is starting postnatally, which we had a lot of debates about that too. Ultimately, nearly all moms give birth in a hospital, but there's quite a bit of variability in terms of who gets prenatal care. And so for that reason, we didn't elect to start prenatally. We did just get another R01 to track longitudinally a cohort that we will be recruiting prenatally. So we would potentially be able to look at that as a mediator. In terms of looking at nutritional outcomes or impacts as mediators in the RCT, in the first year, we're going to be looking at differences in breastfeeding rates. And then at age 2, we don't have it worked out yet, but we'll be looking at differences in child nutrition.
You also have to look at childhood vaccination to refute the vaxxers.
Yeah.
David?
So traditionally, or so I'm given to understand, all the nannies came from very highly educated, I mean, kind of like The Sound of Music or The King and I areas of society, and the Romans had the Greeks and so forth. Our higher socioeconomic status families tend to have childcare in the very early vulnerable years by people who are in the lowest socioeconomic status and have the lowest educational value. Now, is there some way to study the impact of this on verbal capacity later and during the language explosion and so forth?
Yeah, no, absolutely, one could study it. I don't know of anyone who has, but I would hypothesize what you're suggesting, that education of the child's caretaker is going to be positively associated with children's language development.
You would? I understand that childcare generally gets a good, when the kids put in childcare versus not, generally you can't really see much difference, but.
Well, it certainly isn't detrimental. So very broadly speaking, among higher SES families, center-based versus home-based childcare doesn't make a big difference, although home-based by the parent is probably slightly better in terms of cognitive outcomes. For disadvantaged families, high-quality center-based care leads to or is associated with improved child cognitive outcomes. So is it going to dwarf the effect of parents? Probably not. But is it going to be something that would be measurable if you had a large enough sample? Probably.
Presenting this kind of study to an audience like this is always perilous, because they always are asking questions that practically and budgetarily are impossible to include in the study. But just to add one more, drug abuse.
We are looking at that. So we have some questions in the baseline about history of drug abuse during pregnancy, and we're asking questions, follow-up questions as well. So.
Well, listen, we could go on for days, but we're coming to the end of the hour and lunch awaits, so I want to thank you and give you an invitation to come back very soon.
My pleasure. I'd be happy to.